Section 6 of State of the Union Addresses by United States Presidents, 1923 to 1932. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. State of the Union Address. Calvin Coolidge, December 7th, 1926. Part 2. Bituminous Coal. No progress appears to have been made within large areas of the bituminous coal industry toward creation of voluntary machinery by which greater assurance can be given to the public of peaceful adjustment of wage difficulties, such has been accomplished in the anthracite industry. This bituminous industry is one of primary necessity and bears a great responsibility to the nation for continuity of supplies. As the wage agreements in the unionized section of the industry expire on April 1st next, and as conflicts may result which may imperil public interest, and have for many years often called for action on the executive in protection of the public, I again recommend the passage of such legislation as will assist the executive in dealing with such emergencies through a special temporary board of conciliation and mediation and through administrative agencies for the purpose of distribution of coal and protection of the consumers of coal from profiteering. At present, the executive is not only without authority to act, but is actually prohibited by law from making any expenditure to meet the emergency of a coal famine. Judiciary. The federal courts hold a high position in the administration of justice in the world. While individual judicial officers have sometimes been subjected to just criticism, the courts as a whole have maintained an exceedingly high standard. The Congress may well consider the question of supplying fair salaries and conferring upon the Supreme Court the same rule-making power on the law side of the district courts that they have always possessed on the equity side. A bill is also pending providing for retirement after a certain number of years of service, although they have not been consecutive, which should have your favorable consideration. These faithful servants of the government are about the last that remain to be provided for in the post-war readjustments. Banking. There has been pending in Congress for nearly 3 years banking legislation to clarify the National Bank Act and reasonably to increase the powers of the national banks. I believe that within the limitation of sound banking principles, Congress should now and for the future place the national banks upon a fair equality with their competitors, the state banks, and I trust that means may be found so that the differences on branch banking legislation between the Senate and the House of Representatives may be settled along sound lines and the legislation promptly enacted. It would be difficult to overestimate the service which the Federal Reserve System has already rendered to the country. It is necessary only to recall the chaotic condition of our banking organization at the time the Federal Reserve System was put into operation. The old system consisted of a vast number of independent banking units, with scattered bank reserves, which never could be mobilized in times of greatest need. In spite of vast banking resources, there was no coordination of reserves or any credit elasticity. As a consequence, a strain was felt even during crop-moving periods, and when it was necessary to meet other seasonal and regularly recurring needs. The Federal Reserve System is not a panacea for all economic or financial ills. It cannot prevent depression in certain industries, which are experiencing overexpansion of production or contraction of their markets. Its business is to furnish adequate credit and currency facilities. This it has succeeded in doing, both during the war and in the more difficult period of deflation and readjustment which followed. It enables us to look to the future with confidence and to make plans far ahead, based on the belief that the Federal Reserve System will exercise a steady influence on credit conditions and thereby prevent tiny, sudden, or severe reactions from the period of prosperity which we are now enjoying. In order that these plans may go forward, action should be taken at the present session on the question of renewing the bank's charters and thereby ensuring a continuation of the policies and present usefulness of the Federal Reserve System. Federal regulation. I am in favor of reducing, rather than expanding, government bureaus, which seek to regulate and control the business activities of the people. Everyone is aware that abuses exist, and will exist so long as we are limited by human imperfections. Unfortunately, human nature cannot be changed by an act of the legislature. When practically the sole remedy for many evils lies in the necessity of the people looking out for themselves and reforming their own abuses, they will find that they are relying on a false security if the government assumes to hold out the promise that it is looking out for them and providing reforms for them. This principle is preeminently applicable to the national government. It is too much assumed that because an abuse exists, it is the business of the national government to provide a remedy. The presumption should be that it is the business of local and state governments. Such national action results in encroaching upon the salutary independence of the states, and by undertaking to supersede their natural authority, fills the land with bureaus and departments which are undertaking to do what is impossible for them to accomplish, and brings our whole system of government into disrespect and disfavor. We ought to maintain high standards. We ought to punish wrongdoing. Society has not only the privilege, but the absolute duty of protecting itself and its individuals. But we cannot accomplish this end by adopting a wrong method. Permanent success lies in local rather than national action. Unless the locality rises to its own requirements, there is almost irresistible impulse for the national government to intervene. The states and the nation should both realize that such action is to be adopted only as a last resort. The Negro. The social well-being of our country requires our constant effort for the amelioration of race prejudice and the extension to all elements of equal opportunity and equal protection under the laws which are guaranteed by the Constitution. The federal government especially is charged with this obligation in behalf of the colored people of the nation. Not only their remarkable progress, their devotion, and their loyalty, but our duty to ourselves under our claim that we are enlightened people, requires us to use all our power to protect them from the crime of lynching. Although violence of this kind has very much decreased, while any of it remains, we cannot justify neglecting to make every effort to eradicate it by law. The education of the colored race under government encouragement is proceeding successfully and ought to have continuing support. An increased need exists for properly educated and trained medical skill to be devoted to the service of this race. Insular possessions. This government holds in sacred trusteeship islands which it has acquired in the East and West Indies. In all of them, the people are more prosperous than at any previous time. A system of good roads, education, and general development is in progress. The people are better governed than ever before and generally content. In the Philippine Islands, Major General Leonard Wood has been Governor General for 5 years and has administered his office with tact and ability, greatly to the success of the Filipino people. These are a proud and sensitive race who are making such progress with our cooperation that we can view the results of this experiment with great satisfaction. As we are attempting to assist this race toward self-government, we should look upon their wishes with great respect, granting their requests immediately when they are right, yet maintaining a frank firmness in refusing when they are wrong. We shall measure their progress in no small part by their acceptance of the terms of the organic law under which the islands are governed and their faithful observance of its provisions. Need exists for clarifying the duties of the auditor and declaring them to be what everyone had supposed they were. We have placed our own expenditures under the supervision of the Comptroller General. It is not likely that the expenditures in the Philippine Islands need less supervision than our own. The Governor General is hampered in his selection of subordinates by the necessity of securing a confirmation, which has oftentimes driven him to the expediency of using army officers in work for which civilian experts would be much better fitted. Means should be provided for this, and such other purposes as he may require, out of the revenue which this government now turns back to the Philippine Treasury. In order that these possessions might suffer no seeming neglect, I have recently sent Colonel C.A. Thompson to the islands to make a survey in cooperation with the Governor General to suggest what might be done to improve conditions. Later, I may make a more extended report including recommendations. The economic development of the islands is very important. They ought not to be turned back to the people until they are both politically fitted for self-government and economically independent. Large areas are adaptable to the production of rubber. No one contemplates any time in the future, either under the present or more independent form of government, when we should not assume some responsibility for their defense, for their economic advantage, for the employment of their people, and as a contribution to our power of defense, which could not be carried on without rubber. I believe this industry should be encouraged. It is especially adapted to the Filipino people themselves, who might cultivate it individually on small acreage. It could be carried on extensively by American capital in a way to furnish employment at good wages. I am opposed to the promotion of any policy that does not provide for absolute freedom on the part of the wage earners, and do not think we should undertake to give power for large holdings of land in the islands against the opposition of the people of the locality. Any development of the islands must be solely with the first object of benefiting the people of the islands. At an early day, these possessions should be taken out from under all military control and administered entirely on the civil side of government. National defense. Our policy of national defense is not one of making war, but of ensuring peace. The land and sea force of America, both in its domestic and foreign implications, is distinctly a peace force. It is an arm of the police power to guarantee order and the execution of the law at home and security to our citizens abroad. No self-respecting nation would neglect to provide an army and navy proportionate to its population, the extent of its territory, and the dignity of the place which it occupies in the world. When it is considered that no navy in the world, with one exception, approaches ours, and none surpasses it, that our regular army of about 115,000 men is the equal of any other like number of troops, that our entire permanent and reserve land and sea force, trained and training, consists of a personnel of about 610,000, and that our annual proportions are about $680 million a year, expended under the direction of an exceedingly competent staff, it cannot be said that our country is neglecting its national defense. It is true that a cult of disparagement exists, but that candid examination made by the Congress through its various committees has always reassured the country and demonstrated that it is maintaining the most adequate defensive forces in these present years that it has ever supported in time of peace. This general policy should be kept in effect. Here and there, temporary changes may be made in personnel to meet requirements in other directions. Attention should be given to submarines, cruisers, and air forces. Particular points may need strengthening, but as a whole, our military power is sufficient. The one weak place in the whole line is our still stupendous war debt. In any modern campaign, the dollars are the shock troops. With a depleted treasury in the rear, no army can maintain itself in the field. A country loaded with debt is a country devoid of the first line of defense. Economy is the handmaid of preparedness. If we wish to be able to defend ourselves to the full extent of our power in the future, we shall discharge as soon as possible the financial burden of the last war. Otherwise, we would face a crisis with a part of our capital resources already expended. The amount and kind of our military equipment is preeminently a question for the decision of the Congress. After giving due consideration to the advice of military experts and the available public revenue, nothing is more laudable than the cooperation of the agricultural and industrial resources of the country for the purpose of supplying the needs of national defense. In time of peril, the people employed in these interests volunteered in a most self-sacrificing way, often at the nominal charge of $1 a year. But the Army and Navy are not supported for the benefit of supply concerns. Supply concerns are supported for the benefit of the Army and Navy. The distribution of orders on what is needed from different concerns for the purpose of keeping up equipment and organization is perfectly justified. But any attempt to prevail upon the government to purchase beyond its needs ought not to be tolerated. It is eminently fair that those who deal with the government should do so at a reasonable profit. However, public money is expended not that someone may profit by it, but in order to serve a public purpose. While our policy of national defense will proceed in order that we may be independent and self-sufficient, I am opposed to engaging in any attempt at competitive armaments. No matter how much or how little some other country may feel constrained to provide, we can well afford to set the example not of being dictated to by others, but of adopting our own standards. We are strong enough to pursue that method which will be a most wholesome model for the rest of the world. We are eminently peaceful, but we are by no means weak. While we submit our differences with others, not to the adjudication of force, but of reason, it is not because we are unable to defend our rights. While we are doing our best to eliminate all resort to war for the purpose of settling disputes, we cannot but remember that the peace we now enjoy has to be won by the sword, and that if the rights of our country are to be defended, we cannot rely for that purpose upon anyone but ourselves. We cannot shirk the responsibility, which is the first requisite of all government, of preserving its own integrity and maintaining the rights of its own citizens. It is only in accordance with these principles that we can establish any lasting foundations for an honorable and permanent peace. It is for these reasons that our country, like any other country, proposes to provide itself with an army and navy supported by a merchant marine. Yet these are not for competition with any other power. For years we have besought nations to disarm. We have recently expressed our willingness at Geneva to enter into treaties for the limitation of all types of warships, according to the ratio adopted at the Washington Conference. This offer is still pending. While we are and shall continue to be armed, it is not as a menace, but rather a common assurance of tranquility to all the peace-loving people of the world. For us to do any less would be to disregard our obligations, evade our responsibilities, and jeopardize our national honor. Veterans. This country, not only because it is bound by honor, but because of the satisfaction derived from it, has always lavished its bounty upon its veterans. For years, a service pension has been bestowed upon the Grand Army of reaching a certain age. Like provision has been made for the survivors of the Spanish War. A liberal future compensation has been granted to all the veterans of the World War, but it is in the case of the disabled and the dependents that the government exhibits its greatest solicitude. This work is being well administered by the Veterans Bureau. The main unfinished feature is that of hospitalization. This requirement is being rapidly met. Various veteran bodies will present to you recommendations which should have your careful consideration. At the last session, we increased our annual expenditure for pensions and relief on account of the veterans of the three wars. While I approve of proper relief for all suffering, I do not favor any further extension of our pension system at this time. Alien property. We still have in the possession of the government the alien property. It has always been the policy of America to hold that private enemy property should not be confiscated in time of war. This principle we have scrupulously observed. As this property is security for the claims of our citizens and our government, we cannot relinquish it without adequate provision for their reimbursement. Legislation for the return of this property, accompanied by suitable provisions for the liquidation of the claims of our citizens and our Treasury, should be adopted. If government releases to foreigners the security which it holds for Americans, it must at the same time provide satisfactory safeguards for meeting American claims. Prohibition. The duly authorized public authorities of this country have made prohibition the law of the land. Acting under the Constitution, the Congress and the legislatures of practically all the states have adopted legislation for its enforcement. Some abuses have arisen which require reform. Under the law, the national government has entrusted to the Treasury Department the especial duty of regulation and enforcement. Such supplementary legislation as it requires to meet existing conditions should be carefully and speedily enacted. Failure to support the Constitution and observe the law ought not to be tolerated by public opinion, especially those in public places who have taken their oath to support the Constitution ought to be most scrupulous in its observance. Officers of the Department of Justice throughout the country should be vigilant in enforcing the law, but local authorities, which had always been mainly responsible for the enforcement of law in relation to intoxicating liquor, ought not to seek evasion by attempting to shift the burden wholly upon the federal agencies. Under the Constitution, the states are jointly charged with the nation in providing for the enforcement of the Prohibition Amendment. Some people do not like the amendment. Some do not like other parts of the Constitution. Some do not like any of it. Those who entertain such sentiments have a perfect right to seek through legal methods for a change. But for any of our inhabitants to observe such parts of the Constitution as they like while disregarding others is a doctrine that would break down all protection of life and property and destroy the American system of ordered liberty. Foreign relations. The foreign policy of this government is well known. It is one of peace, based on that mutual respect that arises from mutual regard for international rights and the discharge of international obligations. It is our purpose to promote understanding and goodwill between ourselves and all other people. The American people are altogether lacking in an appreciation of the tremendous good fortune that surrounds their international position. We have no traditional enemies. We are not embarrassed over any disputed territory. We have no possessions that are coveted by others. They have none that are coveted by us. Our borders are unfortified. We fear no one. No one fears us. All the world knows that the whole extent of our influence is against war and in favor of peace, against the use of force, and in favor of negotiation, arbitration, and adjudication as a method of adjusting international differences. We look with disfavor upon all aggressive warfare. We are strong enough so that No one can charge us with weakness if we are slow to anger. Our place is sufficiently established so that we need not be sensitive over trifles. Our resources are large enough so that we can afford to be generous. At the same time, we are a nation among nations, and recognize a responsibility not only to ourselves, but in the interests of a stable and enlightened civilization, to protect and defend the international rights of our government and our citizens. It is because of our historical detachment and the generations of comparative indifference toward it by other nations that our public is inclined to consider altogether too seriously the reports that we are criticized abroad. We never had a larger foreign trade than at the present time. Our good offices were never more sought, and the necessity for our assistance and cooperation was never more universally declared in any time of peace. We know that the sentiments which we entertain toward all other nations are those of the most sincere friendship and goodwill, and of all unbounded desire to help, which we are perfectly willing to have judged by their fruits. In our efforts to adjust our international obligations, we have met with a response which, when everything is considered, I believe history will record as a most remarkable and gratifying demonstration of the sanctity with which civilized nations undertake to discharge the mutual obligations. Debt settlements have been negotiated with practically all of those who owed us, and are all finally adjusted but two, which are in process of ratification. When we consider the real sacrifice that will be necessary on the part of other nations, considering all their circumstances, to meet their agreed payments, we ought to hold them in increased admiration and respect. It is true that we have extended to them very generous treatment, but it is also true that they have agreed to repay it all that we loan to them, and some interest. A special conference on the Chinese customs tariff, provided for by the treaty between the nine powers, relating to the Chinese customs tariff signed at Washington on February 26, 1922, was called by the Chinese government to meet at Peking on October 26, 1925. We participated in this conference through fully empowered delegates, and with goodwill endeavored to cooperate with other participating powers with a view to putting into effect promises made to China at the Washington Conference, and considering any reasonable proposal that might be made by the Chinese government for the revision of the treaties on the subject of China's tariff. With these aims in view, the American delegation at the outset of the conference proposed to put into effect the surtaxes provided for by the Washington Treaty, and to proceed immediately to the negotiation of a treaty which, among other things, was to make provision for the abolition of taxes collected on goods in transit, remove the tariff restrictions in existing treaties, and put into effect the national tariff law of China. Early in April of the present year, the central Chinese government was ousted from power by opposing warring factions. It became impossible under the circumstances to continue the negotiations. Finally, on July 3rd, the delegates of the foreign powers, including those of the United States, issued a statement expressing their unanimous and earnest desire to proceed with the work of the conference at the earliest possible moment when the delegates of the Chinese government are in a position to resume discussions with the foreign delegates of the problems before the conference. We are prepared to resume the negotiations thus interrupted whenever a government representing the Chinese people and acting on their behalf presents itself. The fact that constant warfare between contending Chinese factions has rendered it impossible to bring these negotiations to a successful conclusion is a matter of deep regret. Throughout these conflicts, we have maintained a position of the most careful neutrality. Our naval vessels in Asiatic waters, pursuant to treaty rights, have been used only for the protection of American citizens. Silas H. Strawn, Esquire, was sent to China as American Commissioner to cooperate with commissioners of the other powers in the establishment of a commission to inquire into the present practice of extraterritorial jurisdiction in China, with a view to reporting to the governments of the several powers their findings of fact in regard to these matters. The commission commenced its work in January 1926 and agreed upon a joint report which was signed on September 16, 1926. The Commissioner's report has been received and is being studied with a view to determining our future policy in regard to the question of extraterritorial privileges under treaties between the United States and China. The Preparatory Commission for the Disarmament Conference met at Geneva on May 18th, and its work has been proceeding almost continuously since that date. It would be premature to attempt to form a judgment as to the progress that has been made. The Commission has had before it a comprehensive list of questions touching upon all aspects of the question of the limitation of armament. In the Commission's discussions, many differences of opinion have developed. However, I am hopeful that at least some measure of agreement will be reached as the discussions continue. The American representation on the Commission has consistently tried to be helpful and has kept before it the practical objective to which the Commission is working, namely, actual agreements for the limitation of armaments. Our representatives will continue their work in that direction. One of the most encouraging features of the Commission's work thus far has been the agreement in principle among the naval experts of a majority of the powers parties to the Washington Treaty limiting naval armament upon methods and standards for the comparison and further limitation of naval armament. It is needless to say that at the proper time I shall be prepared to proceed along practical lines to the conclusion of agreements carrying further the work begun at the Washington Conference in 1921. Department Reports. Many important subjects, which it is impossible even to mention in the short space of an annual message, you will find fully discussed in the departmental reports. A failure to include them here is not to be taken as indicating any lack of interest, but only a disinclination to state inadequately what has been much better done in other documents. The Capital City. We are embarking on an ambitious building program for the city of Washington. The Memorial Bridge is underway with all that it holds for use and beauty. New buildings are soon contemplated. This program should represent the best that exists in the art and science of architecture. Into these structures, which must be considered as of a permanent nature, ought to go the aspirations of the nation, its ideals expressed in forms of beauty. If our country wishes to compete with others, let it not be in the support of armaments, but in the making of a beautiful capital city. Let it express the soul of America. Whenever an American is at the seat of his government, however traveled and cultured he may be, he ought to find a city of stately proportion, symmetrically laid out and adorned with the best that there is in architecture, which would arouse his imagination and stir his patriotic pride. In the coming years, Washington should be not only the art center of our own country, but the art center of the world. Around it should center all that is best in science, in learning, in letters, and in art. These are the results that justify the creation of those national resources with which we have been favored. American Ideals. America is not and must not be a country without ideals. They are useless if they are only visionary. They are only valuable if they are practical. A nation cannot dwell constantly on the mountain tops. It has to be replenished and sustained through the ceaseless toil of the less inspiring valleys. But its face ought always to be turned upward. Its vision ought always to be fixed on high. We need ideals that can be followed in daily life, that can be translated into terms of the home. We cannot expect to be relieved from toil, but we do expect to divest it of degrading conditions. Work is honorable. It is entitled to an honorable recompense. We must strive mightily. But having striven, there is a defect in our political and social system if we are not in general rewarded with success. To relieve the land of the burdens that came from the war, to release the individual more of the fruits of his own industry, to increase his earning capacity and decrease his hours of labor, to enlarge the circle of his vision through good roads and better transportation, to lace before him the opportunity for education both in science and in art, to leave him free to receive the inspiration of religion. All these are ideals which deliver him from the servitude of the body and exalt him to the service of the soul. Through this emancipation from the things that are material, we broaden our dominion over the things that are spiritual. Calvin Coolidge, December 7th, 1926. End of section 6.